I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Coquille Indian Tribe.
Thank you, Cassie. Good to see you. Rex, would you like to say hello to the group?
Well, hello, I'm Rex Storm with Associated Oregon Loggers, and I am alternate for Amanda Astor. She's on vacation this week.
Okay, everybody reading that pretty clear? We still good? Okay. Well, let's review the agenda real quick then. So we've gotten through a little bit of the little kind of clunky there, but we got through the new participants and maybe had a chance to say hello this morning. So we had if we all recall, a public comment period that was open until Monday evening, November 1st. And Megan was able to send out, there wasn't many comments, but some folks and had sent us, I don't know, 6 or 7 emails, perhaps, very good comments, and worth reading through if you haven't had a chance to. I've taken those comments and highlighted a few things that I'd like to discuss to make sure that we're all on board with that. And then we can look at, again, the timeline of kind of where we are with the request for proposals going out, and then what some of the next steps might be. This is scheduled as our last meeting for a particular portion of the process. But, you know, we can always discuss what else needs to be done and do we need to get together. So we'll have an opportunity there to look at that. And then getting back into the request for proposal documents and kind of hammering through some of that and where we can move forward and trying to get this out for those applicants out there that are chomping at the bit and ready to get going. And that makes a lot of sense. So any other thoughts before I just dive into a few of these items? Okay. I think it's appropriate, and we've made some we've made some promises there that we'd consider public comment, and we rightly should. And so I'd like to go through what I've teased out. If you all have had a chance to look it over as well, please jump in. Can everyone see that sheet that I have up in front of me that is an email?
Yes.
Okay, I heard a blip that I think was a yes. So these are the highlights that I've pulled out. I think it's worth going through these pretty quickly. If anybody wants to discuss anything further, or we recognize that there's points in here that we have not had a chance to discuss and may not find their way into a request for proposals or this process, then let's tease those out and actually think about it a little bit. One of the very first ones, what's the correct amount that triggers the need for a Department of Justice review? It's $150,000 of a contractor agreement. And so that's kind of on ODF's end. We can handle that. That reminds me as well, I forgot, forgive me. We had other comments that on the evening of the 25th that was in our chat, and we're working at putting all those together and having a frequently asked question page on our web page that really gets to a lot of those. And we've had lots of discussion around that. So it's not any real new information, but stand by. We'll get to that as well. So this is just my humble attempt at pulling out information from that was concerns of folks. Darlene Sherman, prescribed burning. If everyone's tracking with me, we've talked about it. It's part of a treatment. I think we're good there. She's interested in tag and extend funding to be limited to 50%. We've also discussed that. We might not have nailed it down, but we're certainly considering that. Assisting communities, especially low income communities in high fire risk. We have talked about that. This is an interesting one that came up, and it came up in our October 25th evening session as well, from Jenna Stillman, on how a community that was around, a town could be engaged with this process. And I answered that night. I thought well, but I'm not sure if it was well enough, but we'll get to this a little bit. I've got some ideas and a flow chart that I'd like to look at and talk about how people can be engaged. I think there's lots of opportunity for this particular scenario to play out within this program. I'll be quiet for a moment if anybody has any thoughts. Here's a description from Jerry Hubbard of some Lapine Fire District issues that they've seen and his involvement there with individual lots. This is something that Alex Romlo has really paid attention to, and I think that fits really nicely, more so in the small Forestland grant program than maybe our larger, but there's a lot of crossover. There's plenty of opportunity to work with communities in what we're doing as well. So I don't think that's been ignored by any means. Let's see. Darlene sends us a second email with some concerns around diversity, including Oregon's diverse populations. We've touched on that. We can certainly discuss that in more detail today, which I think we will. Ensuring that tribal communities receive the request for proposal. Absolutely 100%. I'd be distraught and disappointed if we didn't have some tribal lands engaged in this process. And I think that would be a wonderful opportunity to engage more with our tribal communities. I think we all feel that way. Informational meeting for prospective applicants, a great point from Darlene, one that we've kicked around. And I would say that it's also on our agenda to discuss today, but once the call for proposals and package goes out, I would like to give folks a few days to absorb that, maybe 10 days, maybe a week, and then we schedule an evening session with applicants and go through exactly how to put together a really nice application that covers all the points. It would be a work session that ODF really could manage if you don't have time, but I would absolutely love it. And I think it's appropriate if the work group and technical advisors would also be involved with that to help answer questions. I think that would be a great stroke of business there. Very similarly to, if any of you have gone through an NRCS RCPP proposal, they have put together a really nice workshop prior to submitting those proposals that helped a lot. But then again, it's pretty complex too. So good point from Darlene there. Prioritizing funding projects in the vicinity of communities along evacuation roads. Certainly we've discussed that. It's on our radar. Using prescribed fire is on our radar. We're encouraging that. Here's one that I'd like to unpack a little bit more today. Commercial logging should not be funded by the program. Let's couch that for now and look at the RFP and some additional language in there that may get to that very point. And I think that will be a topic that we would like to discuss probably a little bit more. Important to retain mature trees and some of the prescriptive aspects of how we do the job is in this paragraph from Darlene. Very important idea. One that I get, again, let's couch that with commercial logging and more prescription on the ground and have a little bit more of a conversation about that here in a minute. Commercial thinning should be minimized and fuel management focused around communities and roads. A fair point. I think one that we've all been considering, but again, let's unpack that with a little bit more conversation. Letters of support, I think, is a great idea. We've managed and participated in many grant programs that do require letters of support from the community. I have found those not to be terribly useful, frankly. We get lots of letters that say, yes, we like this project. Fine. We can, 6 or half a dozen, in my opinion. If the group wants to do that, we can put it into the proposal and just say, please send us 2 or 3 letters of support from community members, whether it's a county commissioner or whatever the case may be. That's doesn't matter to me. That's easy. she brings up some points here a little bit about technical assistance and equipment costs and overhead costs. One that I think we have touched on with our 70-30 or our 70-20-10 split, which we can pull up in the RFP and discuss a little bit more. I think we've hit a nice balance there. And I remember pretty distinctly looking at the $15,000 for maximum for equipment as well. Let's couch that again until we open up the RFP, and that'll be another rock that we could probably break pretty easily as we look at that, of exactly how that might look. I've got some ideas that may help folks picture that. Tag and extend projects, we've also discussed what percentage that might look like. I know we've gone from, are there $2 million worth of tag and extend? Are there $10 million of tag and extend? Not quite sure at this point. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think that the general consensus with the group is we're not spending over 50% of this funding on tag and extend. That seems to be a level that we're agreeing with right now, and even a little bit less might be appropriate too. But that $8 million to $10 million range is probably where we'll tumble to. We've got a letter from, let's see, Deborah Higby, Sudyaka. Not sure if I got that right. Some of you may know her. With the Oregon Chapter Sierra Club, and brought up some really good points. Again, some points that I think we should tackle here in just a minute when we pull up the request for proposals. Project should help prevent fire in communities. We're obviously very concerned about that. She has some concern, and her constituents likely, surrounding large fuel breaks that are designed to protect timber values should be deprioritized. Let's put that in our bucket here for conversation in a moment. Brings up examples of treatment with proven track records. We're looking at that. This has come up on a couple of different avenues here, not just from her, that projects with no other funding source should be considered, keeping the program focused on projects that are being that aren't being funded through other means. We can certainly discuss that. I think the complexity of when you get 6 or 8 or 12 landowners and land management agencies all together, this may not be as clearly defined as she might think that is, but we can certainly talk about that. Again, let's put that on our to-do list here in a moment. Again, a comment about commercial logging. Got it. Ecological restoration and resiliency should still allow for the possibility of some marketable products. Let's talk about it here in a minute. Should include evidence and studies that support claims that proposed treatments are effective. We're doing it, including monitoring and assessment. Copy. Each project selected under this program must be screened and held accountable for protecting these critical ecological and environmental values. ODF must provide sufficient oversight and verification. Copy. Got it. That's part of our process. When we have agreements in place, we will provide some form of boots on the ground, whether it's totally contracted out, someone's administering that contract. If ODF or the Forest Service or any of our agency crews or laborers are involved, we're obviously involved in the process. I think this is one that we can check that box. There is a quality control aspect of doing this, and that's getting people on the ground midway with the opportunity to modify scopes of work, and at the end when we're checking invoices against work done, collecting deliverables, and managing the closeout of these grants. This has come up in a couple of different places. And I think I'm getting that there's some dissatisfaction with this, that grant projects will not be subject to any public review or comment. I've heard this not only from Deborah, from a couple of other folks. The process that's in my mind and correct me if you have a different opinion, but that we will have an opportunity again to read and score and rank projects. And that is this work group's charge. I am not comfortable necessarily in opening another public comment period that may last a while to actually look at proposals. That's why we are here today, to get to that point. We don't have time for that, frankly. Not sure it's necessary. Let's couch it. I'm going to be quiet here in 1 minute, and I'd love to hear your take on that. One last input that we got from Deschutes County, Ed Keith. Lots of us know Ed, done some great work over there. He has a little bit of concern about the QWRA and the highest risk classes that we've identified. That's actually identified in 762. So there's not a lot of wiggle room around that. But then there's some other, as we all read through this, he's describing some areas that don't really show up in those 4 highest risk classes, but would be really important to participate in the program. I think that's really what he's getting at. And I don't disagree in any way, shape, or form. And we've touched on that. And I think that's a conversation we might want to just ferret out a little bit more on exactly where, we're doing these projects. Just to wrap it up from Ed, asking for a correction because you can look at the map that ODF is proposing. It's not ODF proposing it. Frankly, it's 762. And using depicting watersheds 4 highest risk classes just doesn't pass the gut check. That is going to accurately prioritize state funding where the actual risk is. Possibly consider a revision to the map. So I'm going to get rid of this and listen to you all. I'd love to facilitate some conversation. I think there's 3 things we should talk about. It's about commercial logging. It's about program income, and it's about where on the ground we do this in relation to what 762 is calling for us to do as far as the risk. Any other points, please bring them up.
Jeff, this is Alex here with the Oregon Department of Forestry Small Forestland Grant Program. I did just want to make a note on that public comment portion. I think what I heard from you and I agree with is that, in terms of selecting projects, there's probably not much room there. But what a number of grants do, and maybe something to look into, would be, kind of posting selected grants or ranking. So awarded grant applications may be made available, at which point we would be able to get public input that would inform future grant selection rollouts. Just a thought there, but.
That's a great idea, Alex. I like that a lot, but I would be cautious to slow down the process too much on the flip side, just so that we can get started on projects with a short time frame. But great point, Alex. Thank you.
This is Chandra. I have a couple of comments,
Please go ahead.
if you don't mind me jumping in.
Please.
I honestly, I think this is a great illustration of how important it is to have that public meeting, because these are really great thoughts from a variety of people. So I appreciate that they did this. I think a number of points made by pretty much everyone could be addressed in something I'm kind of thinking about down the line. How do we take these fairly broad, in a way, criteria that are laid out in SB 762 and then sort of put our more refining eye as a work group on them when it comes to actually prioritizing the project that we get in through the RFP. And so I guess, so a lot of the detail oriented stuff that we just can't put in this RFP, but we might want to talk about prior to, the ranking process. So maybe we can plan to address that, at future meetings, maybe right before the end of the review, the proposal period, where we really get into, some of those details on what we think as a group we want to prioritize, and how we want to think about some of those more, detailed things. Where exactly on the landscape? How might we refine? Obviously, we can't change the map that we're working with or what the bill says, but what sort of things might we want to prioritize that don't show up super well on the map, to sort of address what Ed said. So anyway, things down the line that we're not going to get to in putting out the RFP, but that we want to consider. I think there's a lot of stuff in these comments that we should put in that bucket. So just a suggestion there. And then the one other thing is, on the letters of support question, I just had an idea, a thought, and I haven't gone back and looked at the other application materials other than the RFP. I looked at it once when we first sent them out, but the sort of things that you plug into the application, perhaps instead of letters of support, I understand the whole, maybe it's not super useful, but if there's a box to demonstrate how, and I'm looking at the bill language now, demonstrate how, the project is, part of a collaborative partnership, leveraging the collective power, across ownerships, that sort of stuff that's in the RFP. Just give people an opportunity in the application to lay that out. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a letter of support, but it gives them a chance to say, hey, we've been working with this forest collaborative or this fire district, or et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a suggestion in the application. And maybe it's already there. Like I said, I haven't looked at it recently.
Great point, Chandra. And to your last one first, it is part of that. One of the boxes that we would score is how collaborative and what partnerships are really being implemented there. So really good point. We could tease that out through that application process. I've also, as you were speaking, I was thinking of written word versus spoken word. And you're right. I mean, I think we're in a pretty good spot probably with the call for proposals that we can't anticipate, and we can't put every single nuance into that document. When people have to read it, they have to get a sense of what we're looking for. So maybe there's an opportunity, a week after that goes out, that we have another public webinar for all of those applicants out there. And we have an opportunity during that time to really speak to the intent of 762 and some of our loftier goals on how we can do this, and what we'll be looking for when we're looking for proposals. And so, we can have that conversation perhaps, rather than, trying to kind of shoehorn every bit of nuance into that request for proposal that might get a little bit cumbersome at that point for someone to actually read. Anyway, just thinking out loud, but great point, Chandra. Thank you. Oh, yeah, this is Zoom. Do we have, I don't know if I see people raising hands or just speak up. I can't remember how Zoom works. We have a chat. Let's see. Cultural resources. Thank you, Cassie. Okay. Have we discussed how this process might address or affect cultural resources by wildfire, including suppression and restoration efforts? Great point. And when we look at suppression, real quick, just to get that nugget kind of teased out of there, ODF at least, and I think the Forest Service does as well, probably all of our fire resources, we have all gone through some training, and there are some protocols in place that during suppression activity, we take that very seriously. Not that everyone on the ground is going to be an expert in that or can identify cultural resources, especially in the heat of an initial attack, or the chaos of a larger fire. But I do know that there are opportunities to stop, to hold back, and to get other professionals in. And many times with our teams, especially when we build them out, we do have cultural resource experts in the field that are with suppression resources that can address that. So I do know that happens. As far as our program is concerned for restoration and what we're talking about, we certainly have an opportunity to look at that. It is required by 762 in some form when we especially look at NEPA ready projects on Forest Service property. Private lands are not required to go through the NEPA process. So there might be a little bit of a difference there, but I do know that our staff that works with private landowners have gone through particular training and have the documentation that we review annually to at least pause and identify to the best of our ability when working with private landowners. That is as far as a SHPO is concerned. I believe that's as far as we can go with that. But it's addressed in the request for proposals to some degree on other lands other than private lands.
Okay, yeah, thank you for just noting that. I didn't see it, so perhaps I didn't see it other than the fact that it said that it would go through NEPA review. But and I won't harp on my challenges to ODF, and that the state, I've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years talking about the state's failure to address culture resources during suppression efforts, especially where they're not documented on SHPO's website, but they are documented on tribes. If that's a conversation you all want to have separately from this, I can bring you into the loop on some of those challenges. But more specifically to what you're saying, where some of your staff are trained and are reviewing those as far as SHPO's website. Just a reminder to everybody on this call is that SHPO is not the be all end all in culture resources. Tribes have information that is not available to SHPO, and more often than not, those things are significantly affected by these types of activities. And so by not including TIPOs and tribal culture resources staff in that review, you have the potential to seriously affect really significant resources. So please remember to include tribes in those types of review and assessments.
Cassie, great point. Thank you for bringing that up. That does fall into the bucket more of suppression and some of our other folks that aren't on this call. And let's leave it at that and pick up that conversation with some of those other folks that need to be there. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's see, Eric, Chandra, let's go to Chandra's comment here. Yes, absolutely. That's a major concern for me. I trust that ODF staff will take the finalized RFP to inform the language in the application. You bet. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. That's one thing that's keeping me up every night from 2 to 3:30.
Well, no, oh no.
Oh, it's okay. I'm up anyway, thinking about other things. I might as well throw that in there too. Okay. Letters of support from Eric. Thanks, Eric. They can be useful in identifying true community support, but can also be time consuming for applicants. Yeah, great point. And sometimes difficult to obtain. Agency partners may not have the authority to sign a letter. Yeah, good copy there. We found the same thing, a little cumbersome sometimes to get those in. What we could do is encourage letters of support, but not require them. And if someone can't get letters of support and it becomes a hindrance for them to submit an application, then we certainly don't want to do that. Okay. Any other thoughts, comments? I've got a couple of things that may help answer some of these questions or help develop the conversation a little bit more. Pete, I see a hand.
Thanks, Jeff. I was just going to make the comment, we included the additional criteria in there about using best available science, and it seemed like at least some of those initial public comment letters were reflecting on the need for these projects, particularly those aimed at increasing landscape resilience, ecological restoration, et cetera, be guided by that best available science. I think that that's, you know, to me, it underscores the importance of having that criteria in there and making sure that, you know, as we review those proposals, we're aware of where some of that debate lies, because it's certainly not as if it's, you know, there was a paper reference. I noted one of the citations around the Mal-Drexler paper, which had some methodological flaws and sort of misuse of some data sets that weren't appropriate to make some of the conclusions that were made in that paper. And so I just think it's one of those areas where, you know, we'll have to do our best, but recognize too that in answering those questions, different groups and entities are going to have different perspectives, perhaps. So just throwing that out there. But I think it's important that that criteria remain in there for that very reason.
Thank you, Pete. Okay, any other comments before we move into a couple of items I'd really like to tackle? Al, sorry, go ahead. Your hand is up.
My hand's up and my internet seems to be flagging. Can you put your thumb up if you hear me?
If I can find my thumb.
Okay. Oh, I meant a real thumb up.
Oh,
That's all.
I know where that one is.
So just to Chandra's point about aligning the RFP to the application is, and you probably have this in line, but I'm thinking at some point there'll probably be a scoring rubric put together, which takes all those points from the RFP. And, you know, the raters will use that just for an objective scoring system. Is that something you have kind of lined up down the road?
Absolutely. I found my other thumb there, Al.
Okay.
And that's what I was referring to earlier about kind of taking some of these suggestions and a lot of our conversation and putting it into, yeah, something like that, a rubric.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And that's a good segue. I think we're all on the same page there. So let's talk a little bit about just how the flow of some of this may look, knowing that we have 3 or 4 hot topics that we need to get to today. Where am I sharing? Come on, there it is. Can you see that application flow chart? Chandra, I'm seeing you nod. So let's go for it. Okay, so this is one of the, I don't know if it's an issue, but one of the items that I think we should probably tackle to some degree as we move along. And so and thank you, Megan, for helping put this together, but we came up with this maybe as an opportunity to discuss just the mechanics of how we need to do business. So we've had a lot of creative space, I think, in, you know, getting the RFP out, making sure the language is right so that we're getting quality projects, you know, that we think are appropriate. And then we're going to get into a bit of a second mode here that would be, okay, what next? So we've got 35, 40, 50 projects. And so what next? What's the logistics of getting to the point where we're actually have agreements in place and we're working on the ground? And I thought this might be helpful. So anyway, I have not used the word sponsor very often in this process because it just connotates other things in my world. But maybe that's what we need to call it because it does make sense. And Alex has used it effectively in his small Forestland grant program. But if we have a state forest opportunity and there's a portion of planning that's been in place and they can identify $300,000 of project with deliverables, great. A private subdivision, Elk Run Estates, they have an HOA that has a CWPP already in place. They've identified $500,000 worth of work around that subdivision in the name of fuel breaks or whatever the case may be, ingress, egress, so on and so forth. The Forest Service has $800,000 of projects they've identified on the books that might include thinning, and, burning piles, and then maybe some prep for a prescribed fire. Great. ODF&W, one of our state partners, through ODF perhaps, might have an opportunity to treat some lands in that landscape. A private ranch might have a very strategic, accessible area that goes through the ranch on up into state forest property and has use for it. And then some private timber ground that needs to work along the edges, another fuel break that would help protect ODF&W property. Great. These are just examples. So as all of those entities can get together and build out an application that goes to a central applicant, and that might be, maybe we do call it a sponsor. Maybe that is an ODF district or unit that has the capacity to do such. Maybe it's a nonprofit, or it's a Forest Service employee. Somebody collects these portions of scopes of work and budget items and builds out one application. And that's really what we're looking for. They might have as well, and I put sustainable, a water conservation district in there as well, that there's an opportunity for that applicant or that entity there to provide some reporting or some monitoring aspect of the project. Then they very well could have some financial, some budget item in there at the same time. So as that is built together, the application comes into us rolled up in one piece of application that we can review for a $2.75 million project. We take a look at that as a work. We review it, score it, rank it. We vet that through the criteria that we've built. It's a good project. It's one that we feel is appropriate. We want to move on it. Then you can give ODF that recommendation. So the top 5 or 6 projects that we feel are good projects. At that point, we'll break that back up into individual agreements with each one of those entities so that we can manage those for those people. And so we would have 6 different agreements that would then be able to provide reimbursement for expenditures on the ground for each one of those units, so to speak. Where we would help build out an individual budget and a scope of work for that particular unit of measure, say, on the ground. And then we would start that process, and that would be the mechanical aspect, I would call it, of how ODF would engage at the agreement level. Is that helpful? Chandra, you're nodding, and it makes me feel really good that somebody's listening.
Well,
Andrew, thanks for the thumbs up.
I guess I'm just, that all makes a ton of sense, but I guess just to clarify, all projects wouldn't necessarily do this as far as all the entities kind of coming together to put together a single application. I mean, we don't anticipate all of them probably looking like that, but I understand how you're putting it together like this.
No, this is just one example of, I had a couple of personal phone calls, with folks that were interested last, I don't even know what day it is, Monday, Tuesday or something, that had a little bit of some difficulty maybe envisioning how so many people could be involved in one project. And so this was kind of born out of that conversation of, this is an opportunity, a possibility of how it could work within the complexity of having 5, 6, or 7 different entities on the same landscape. And so that's really what I was getting at there. I see, Eric, you have a hand up. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think I understand this, and I think it's really attractive to have kind of lump things together into one application where possible. I see there's probably a lot of places where that can't occur given sort of the short timeframes. But I'm curious as to, if you have in this example, one application, why they would then have 6 different agreements if those were all funded ultimately. Wouldn't it be easier just to have the one agreement with that applicant? And then
Absolutely, it would be. You got, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought you were done there, but real quick, absolutely would be, because I'm trying to manage the workload that we have in our small shop as well. Because that will become important as time gets by, of how responsive we can be. But these are all reimbursable. And so it's really, you know, if State Forest does a bunch of work, you know, they're carrying that load, so to speak. Private landowners that go out and do work, you know, they've got to send invoices into us. And so, you know, a $2.75 million project is really difficult for one entity to carry until we can get the invoices in and properly vet those, move them through the system, and get reimbursements back out to people. And so this is just an option there to allow a little bit more flexibility on the back end of, you know, so someone's not carrying that financial burden for a number of months. That would be the only difficulty, so that we could break these down into responsive units, I guess, on the financial side a little bit better. But if the Forest Service, for instance, came in and said, look, we've got, you know, a $3 million project as well, and it really involves us and one other private landowner, and we're going to do the entire project, and we don't expect a reimbursement for that work for 3 or 4 or 5 months anyway, we can certainly do that with one agreement. I see a chat here. Anyone else? Okay, Chris, thanks for pulling that language out for the application and submitted and managed by. And we can certainly pivot if you'd like and pull the RFP up and start looking at some specifics in there. Any other thoughts about how we might manage this out of our shop, and any final thoughts on that? Pete.
Maybe a bit of a ragged thought, but I'm basing this off of just conversations I've had locally and within TNC. And I'm going to use OWEB's FIP projects as an example here. So Eric, you can jump in if I get any of this wrong. But one of the elements that I think is really powerful about the FIP process, especially around these projects that involve multiple entities or multiple, you know, landowners or land managers coming together, is that it really sort of, as best I understand, really requires kind of a demonstration of a functioning, let's call it a collaborative effort, because we all know that that's kind of a critical element to make these projects successful. You can't necessarily count on a group of entities or organizations that haven't worked together successfully to throw themselves together, manage a huge multi-million-dollar project, and have it really come out the other end effectively. And when we've had those conversations, at least here in Central Oregon, we've realized that that's, you know, it's really, that is critical. I mean, think about examples of like our Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project that has experience bringing these groups together to help manage larger landscape scale projects. And I just think it's worth bearing in mind that just, you know, sort of the potential efficiencies here are real, and especially on the internal management side of things. But I also think it doesn't necessarily come without its costs too, or potential pitfalls if these groups don't really, you know, have experience or success working together. I'm not saying that in this case, your example, wouldn't work perfectly well, but it's just something to be aware of, that forcing people to work together or encouraging people to work together that don't have that track record may not necessarily lead to the best project outcome as an individual working alone. So just throwing it out there again, good thought.
You bet. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, I completely agree and have seen that in years past as well. One of the scoring criteria that we have that we've identified really is that it is collaborative in nature and it's working across boundaries and so forth. So I think this maybe paints a picture of how that might look. But we certainly have a lot of creative space. There's people out there that are thinking of all sorts of great projects that could be done on the landscape that might look a little different than this. Okay, I'm going to pull up the latest RFP.
Hey, Jeff, real quick. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead. Yes.
Hi, this is Brenda Hallmark. Sorry, I jumped on late. I'm on the phone. I lost service there and then it switched to Zoom, so it took me a minute. Can you clarify when you say it's a reimbursable, in my mind, like if a Forest Service unit put in an application for a project, they would have to fund that project and then the state would reimburse them. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's correct. And so we don't front money. We don't have the money, so to speak, here in an account that we would then, well, we do, but it's a little bit different than that, that we would just, give money for a plan. So, we would accept invoices for work that is accomplished.
Okay.
And then we would go through the process of paying those invoices. And so there's a little bit of a delay there that is sometimes difficult for smaller organizations or individual landowners.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks for bringing that up. Chris, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just real quick, would you consider an HOA a nonprofit in this construct? Many of them are, or they're, sort of legal entities operating.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think so. I've worked with some in the past that have been, have nailed it. Just they've had the board of directors available and they've built projects out and done a great job doing that.
Hey, Jeff, can you hear me?
Yes.
I might have been off mute for quite a while. Who knows what noises I've been making in the background here, typing and other things. Just jumping in on that real quick. In order for them, they have to actually be a nonprofit. So many homeowners associations likely are a legal entity of some kind, but just jumping in on that, on a finer point on that qualification is that they have to actually be a 501c3 nonprofit or some other legal entity. If that makes sense.
Yes. That's a rabbit trail. Never mind. Thanks, Ryan. You bet. Okay, so let's break some other rocks here. Rex, please go ahead.
So, yeah, triggering that nonprofit discussion, that's a pretty big basket, and is that mandatory then? And when somebody mentioned a 501c3, there are many other categories of nonprofits, so folks need to understand that. But your first question is a nonprofit mandatory, and why is that?
It's a good question. One that I was hoping we might have when we had a couple of more hours to discuss it. But there it is. So from my perspective, and I'm just one person, we have been managing federal grants for a number of years here, as well as OWEB has and other entities that can certainly speak to this. And that is a requirement to manage federal grants that certain entities can apply for them and be the downstream user of these grant funds. So we've always been very careful about how we manage those federal dollars. This new opportunity with general fund does open up a different conversation on how and who and why we're doing certain things. I was on the Holiday Farm fire I don't want to get into great detail of all that, but I recognized, and I've gotten some feedback from some others from across a wide spectrum of interests, that particular fire and others that we saw in Labor Day, it doesn't make a lot of sense that we don't try to reach out and assist timber entities on the ground where it makes sense. But it has not happened in the past. We have not opened that conversation. And so it's kind of taboo, but I think it's probably time we think about that. There, I said it.
I guess, the reason I raise the question is, by definition, many of, or I would suspect that there are viable entities, there are consulting firms, there would be very effective collators of bringing all these different parties together. And so because an entity pays taxes should not exclude them for participating in producing effective results. But that's, I don't know. I'm kind of a latecomer here, so I don't know enough background of what the mandatory requirements are. But from a business standpoint, by definition, if you excluded anybody that pays taxes and makes a profit, if you're excluding them, you're excluding probably 80% of the most efficient entities that could do this work.
Jeff, if I could.
Real quick, I think, and please, Dylan, just say, I think real quick, Rex, don't disagree with you. But I think that the point being is that we've just never done it that way. And so there's a long-standing federal requirement that we've been adhering to, but time for more discussion. Dylan, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm just looking at the language from the RFP, right? I mean, so it's not just NGOs, it's local, state, tribal, as well as nonprofit entities, which is consistent with all the other RFPs that you already administer, right? I mean, those were all the entities that we had in the e-board funding. We have in other state and private grants that come through the state, right? Like community fire assistance grants, like those are the same eligible entities, correct?
Absolutely.
We never allow for-profit entities to apply for funds for these. They get subcontracted out to for-profit entities, but they've always historically gone through those organizations, correct?
That is exactly the case. And that, the involvement is, contracted out work. But, maybe it's worth having a conversation of, if there's a for-profit entity that could serve as a sponsor in a community, maybe it's worth thinking about.
I guess my question, I mean, Rex, with that in mind, do you still have that concern? I mean, when we've applied for these, we always contracted out to for-profit businesses, obviously. We just are responsible for the administration and all the reporting obligations.
Chat, let's see.
Yeah, here we don't all have to agree. It's just there's more of you than there are of me. So I just want to point it out to you. You're designing in something that will limit your field of candidates that can do efficient work for you. It's not a deal breaker for me, but you need to consider the cause and effect.
Yeah, and we're shooting for the same thing, Rex. I think it's all of us in it together for sure. When we're burning hundreds of thousands of acres across the landscape, any of these conversations are worth having to see where we can go with this. I think that the key point being, though, and Dylan, thanks for reminding me, is that, these projects typically are at the tip of the spear. The work on the ground is being done by many of those companies out there that have the ability and the knowledge and the equipment to do it, as well as a combination of agency folks that have the experience, as well as our nonprofit partners that provide oversight and perhaps a different perspective on protection and things like that. So I think this captures it well. what I've highlighted here in the RFP. And that brings me to one other point. If I may, here's a rock that I really wanted to try to look at today and get some perspective on, is the idea of program income. So in that scenario that I had painted there with that little flow chart, you know, within any one of those entities, it might be at the ranch on rangeland, it might be on the Forest Service, and it might be on private timber. Any one of those entities could go through a project and lo and behold, find that there is some material that is being managed for fire mitigation that is also a product. And so I'd love to get people's feedback, but a little background on what we have done in the past. Our federal grants and how we manage those. There's a couple of other categories, but the easiest and most straightforward is called an additive process with our federal partners. And essentially that's it right there. If my share screen is up correctly, in that yellow box, any anticipated project income.
We're not seeing that, Jeff.
Clearly in the budget. Okay. Thanks. What's going on? How about now?
Looks good.
Yep.
All right, cool. So Rex et al., there's that gray box of the applicant and some of that language we've been discussing. And then just below that, the federal, I just twisted the federal, that's a terrible word, but I did. The federal language, massaged it, that's a little bit better, so that it fit our needs a little bit better. And so any anticipated project income must be stated clearly in the budget and budget narrative, and may be used as match or added into the project total with a clear deliverable identified, as in additional acres, additional outreach material, etc. And those one-offs, or maybe it's more common than I expect, but I don't expect it very often, that there is a product coming off of the property from the project, that it will be added to treat acres or used as match to treat additional acres. I'd love to get some feedback.
Jeff, this is Alex. I may add before project closeout, or within the project period.
Great point. Yep.
I have a question, a clarifying question, I guess. Are we talking about activities that might generate income that are part of this program's funding, or the project funded by this program? Or are we talking about activities that might be a larger project? I'm thinking about on federal land, there's might be like a really big project and this program is just funding a small amount of it. And so, that other piece might be generating income. I guess, are we talking about that, or are we talking about within the defined project that's being applied for? And then I might have follow-up questions, but I want a clarification on that.
Okay, and from my perspective only, I'd love to hear from some other folks. And Chris, I see your hand. The way it's worked for us, it's within the project footprint. It's part of the fire mitigation or fuels treatment project. It is not in addition to going off of project and creating a product for some other reason. It's part of a fire mitigation plan. And it just so happens that those acres that are treated are generating some product that doesn't just sit on the ground, but actually moves off and can be additive to the overall project. That's how we've seen it done in the past. And it hasn't happened very often.
And that makes sense to me, especially, I guess one of my concerns is if, income generating activities that aren't sort of a part of this project that we're funding might not have to meet the same criteria and sideboards as, you know, as we're laying out here. And so I would want to make sure that what we're applying this to is all has the same criteria applied.
Yeah, and real quick, Chandra, just a moment, Chris. Where we have seen that work, is it that any anticipated project income must be clearly stated in the budget and budget narrative? And then that gives us an opportunity to take a look at the project and say, yeah, that makes sense because it's predetermined, rather than just showing up at the end and saying, oh, guess what? We also treated 100 acres for something, and you know, we generated this income. That won't be allowed at the
makes
end
sense.
of the project.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no reason for apologies. That's a good conversation. I guess my only concern is that sometimes generated income is used to offset treatment costs when they're not positive, and it's not really addressed here. We're sort of saying you got to do more work with that money rather than reducing the actual acreage cost of treatment.
Oh, good point. Is there another word that we might use that makes a better point of that than project income?
Chris was reading my mind as usual. A couple steps ahead. The thought I was having was this very thing of like how, you know, I'm thinking about stewardship contracting, for example, on federal forest land, where those dollars can either be used to offset treatment costs, or if there is a surplus of receipts, it gets put in that whole retained receipts pool and can be used for additional restoration or something like that. But so in this case, I wonder if Chris's point could be made or inserted here with some language about simply that, like that income can be used to offset project costs, or if there's surplus could be used to, you know, achieve additional acres within the project or something like that. Just thinking out loud. I don't know if that, yeah, I'll throw it out there. It's not perfect.
Yeah, I think that clarifying that might help address some of the comments that we got, the public comments as well. I think one of them said should be funding things that don't otherwise have funding. So just a little bit of clarification might address that.
Okay, let's take a stab, and I can do this kind of offline too, is build out a better explanation here. But Pete, let me circle back to something you had mentioned with stewardship contracts, that there's a pot of receipts there of program income that could be utilized later. And I just want to clarify, you know, we would be in a tough spot, I think, in managing this in a biennium to have anything that any fund or, you know, coffer of some sort that would go beyond our implementation period. We don't want to get into that business, but maybe you could help me understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, no, I was not suggesting a complete parallel effort or a complete parallel to like an integrated resource timber contract where there are retained receipts that get managed later. In this case, I was simply saying, you know, when you look at stewardship contracting, there are projects where the value or the income, and granted, I'm speaking outside of my lane here because I don't work for the Forest Service or manage stewardship contracts, but there are projects where the costs exceed any sort of income. And in those cases, any income is used to offset the cost of projects. And then there are projects where the income exceeds the cost of treatment, and those additional retained receipts can be used for additional acres. You're right, in the case of those,
right,
those Forest Service IRTC projects, those can be pooled and used later. And I'm not suggesting that in this case at all. I'm simply saying that, you know, that there are two potential pathways for that income to be used: offset cost or used to treat additional acres. So.
Copy, thanks. Dylan, go ahead.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think those are the two correct pathways. I mean, we had that experience on the e-board funding that we received because we did work on federal lands out there on the Umatilla, and it was 95% service work on juniper mitigation and small diameter thinning, but there was some commercial pine and fir that was generated as a result of that. And even though we met the deadline for the use of our ODF money and our agreement expired, we had this separate agreement with the feds that specifically required it to go back into the next stewardship project. So we used those retained receipts for additional thinning and juniper mitigation on there. So, I mean, in this case, if we're generating any project income, it'd be on federal land, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. And then we would just have a separate arrangement with the feds to use that. So that would probably solve the problem for us, correct?
Although that's a good question, Dylan, like not all of these projects are going to be on federal land. So what happens when there's not that, additional level of agreement?
Yeah, right.
Agreement.
Yeah, right. I mean, I guess that's important. I mean, if we're doing work on private land and there is some sort of commercial material, I assume the landowner is going to want to keep the revenue, but maybe that's a condition of receiving the funds is that it has to go back into additional restoration activities and they're foregoing any profit.
Yeah, that's the way I pictured it as well. And I'm thinking of our G&A program as well on federal land, and that would be a whole different process and agreement, on the federal side. But private land, I think it's probably the simplest for us in this time frame to, say this is additive and you need to show that you're continuing to treat property and that there's additional acres treated or whatever the case may be. And that's a condition of receiving funds. If we have this built into years of general fund program that we're continuing, we may be able to change that to some degree, but the short time frame, I think we ought to keep this as simple as we can.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, admittedly, I think any commercial value generated from this work on private lands is probably going to be fairly incidental. I could be wrong, but I would assume that any private landowner would have already had a separate operation for that and would be using these dollars for service work that they could otherwise pay for. But there might be some, right? Like if we're doing some like fuel breaks, maybe we're able to generate some board feet, but hopefully it's modest enough that we could just roll back into the budget. And then, yeah, and I agree, Chandra, just to basically have a catch-all term, any program income generated from this needs to be reinvested. Otherwise, if a landowner won't support that, then they just need to undertake their own harvest operation and not use general fund dollars.
With that word too. Reinvested. I'll get that in there. Any other thoughts about that? This could be pretty complex if we made it that way. I'm sure there's probably lots of ways to skin this cat. I'm sorry, cat lovers. I think in our meetings, I've killed a couple of birds and skinned a cat. Sorry.
As long as you have a incidental take permit, you're all right.
Okay. Let me check the chat real quick and see where we are with folks. Oh, feed two birds with one scone. I'm confused, Eric. Does that have to do with a cat?
No, it's just a silly play on the kill two birds. With
a scone. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the future, Jeff.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Okay, there's one rock that really I think we've probably nailed pretty well, and I think we'll have an opportunity to look at each one of these proposals that comes in and say, this is beyond scope, this is not where we want to go, or yeah, this fits in pretty well and it's pre-identified. And I think that's a catch-all for us that will be helpful. I did want to move into two things. One is maybe address some of the concerns from Ed Keith a little bit on MAP and how we approach that beyond the language that we see in this RFP. And then the second is I want to circle back to the DEI language and make sure there's a comfort level there. Chandra, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's outside of those two items, though. I want to get to those, but, and I don't know where to put this, but I hadn't really thought through until I read, I think it was Darlene's comment about prescribed fire and how hard it can be to, get that done in a certain period of time. And maybe having a contingency plan. I don't remember exactly what she suggested, but I just want to see how should we address that? Because it's a really good point. I think we want to encourage the use of prescribed fire. It's a really important tool, but it can be hard to get done within a certain timeline. So just wanted to throw that out there as something that we may need. I don't know, if it goes in the RFP or if it's something that we ask people to elaborate on in the application itself.
Great point. And this is how we've done it in the past. And I hope this works. It has actually, is that people that have a prescribed fire component in the proposal beyond prepping. Obviously prepping is, lining and cutting and all that mechanical labor. We identified that at midstream of those particular projects, we're going to touch base with all these folks October of 22, and we have a modification process. And if we're finding that we're missing windows and it's beginning to be a point where we're not getting prescribed fire on the ground, then we have an opportunity in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 months of the program to circle back and start treating more acres. And we can do modifications as we see fit. And we have, folks on the ground checking that.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Jeff, could I ask a follow-up on that same question?
Please,
Andrea?
please.
So there was a commentary in the chat during the public Q&A about encouraging or emphasizing alternatives to burning. I don't know. Do folks remember that, Jeff? Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, while, I tend to agree that maybe those alternatives ought to be considered, especially in Chandra's example here, where, say you don't have your burn window and you're not gonna be able to execute. So you want to use some alternative that achieves some of the outcome, but frankly, from an ecological resilience perspective, particularly when we're talking about fire dependent systems, there really isn't an alternative to achieve some of those restorative processes that you're trying to get through fire. And I guess I just wonder if are there ways, behind the scenes with ODF working in partnership with DEQ through smoke management to try to address some of those barriers to allow implementation to happen, especially in these areas where we're clearly prioritizing them through a selection through this process and investing state, general fund dollars in them to make sure that, or I guess I can't say make sure, but to help them get those prescribed fire treatments implemented.
Wasn't there something somewhere else in SB 762 that tried to address some of those barriers? I could be wrong. It might have just been something that was talked about in like the fire council or hearings, but I don't know if it made it in there.
There is some other language in there that ODF specifically is tackling, and that's standing up a prescribed burn program. And we're actually hiring some folks right now to get them in place, working on some of the statutes that allow a little bit more flexibility with prescribed fire. And that does include working with DEQ about air quality and air sheds and things like that. And obviously you're right, Pete. There will be some limitations and, we can't burn all the time when we want, but I believe that process is happening. Now, does it coincide and really marry up with what we're talking about right here? Great point. I don't know that. I can have some internal conversations with our protection folks and see, if we can get that on the radar to track along, as well with OSU fire extension, their new fire program. So a coordinated effort is a good idea. I'm not sure I can point to any real, hard products that were developed at this point.
So Jeff, I can jump in since
Please.
I have been working with the Rules Advisory Committee for the Certified Burn Manager Program. And the main focus of Section 25 in Senate Bill 762 is to establish a Certified Burn Manager Program for burns across property boundaries to be able to make sure the owners get permissions, that sort of thing, and have some liability protection if they have a burn plan that's registered and follow the plan, they get some liability protection from that. So that is the main focus of the standing up the Certified Burn Manager Program, consulting with others and getting input from Oregon's Prescribed Fire Council.
Thank you, Derek. Great point. Appreciate that. Any follow-up there?
I was just going to point out too, I was trying to find the exact location in the bill, but I think there is an element too where ODF is going to report on barriers to implementing prescribed fire. It's not a programmatic change per se as a reporting requirement, I think, for ODF to complete for the legislature. Dylan or someone else who was in the weeds on the bill language itself might be able to point us in the direction, but I do think there is something in there that is going to continue to flesh out those elements of what are the barriers / opportunities to enhance enabling conditions to facilitate more fire on the ground. I just think that that's, particularly important, especially, places we're seeing where, in the bootleg fire, for example, from this past summer, where prescribed fire really made a critical difference in changing the impact on these ecosystems. And I think that's part of landscape resilience. It's not necessarily about community risk reduction, but in this case, increasing the resilience of these dry forest ecosystems and their components to in the face of these extreme mega fires or extreme fires is another important part of landscape resilience, more focused on the ecological side than the human side, but nonetheless important.
Thank you, Pete.
Hey, Jeff, another connection that would be great to make is with DEQ and their community smoke response plan program. They put out money last year that we took advantage of. There's another grant program this year. So if you have communities that are putting in grants, either competitive or the tag and extend in this program, you might want to suggest they connect to that program if they're feeling like prescribed fire implementation is being limited by smoke management opportunities. They can create these plans that allow them add a degree of flexibility, and they can get grant money to actually create those plans and implement them.
Thank you very much, Chris. And that leads me to, think about just internally here, when we kind of stand this up and get in a comfortable spot, we got a lot of work to do. But when we get there, it would pay for us to bring our disparate parts together on occasion and really have these conversations of how we're interacting with each other, within these grant programs and proposals. And I think we can get there. Okay, we have a half an hour left. Let's take a look at our DEI language. I think I'm still sharing. And here's the language that it's found its way in here. That's pretty simple. A little less than we may recall from our last iteration, and then a little more in some respect. My proposal is that we leave this in as an opportunity for folks to see it, to think about it, and to view these projects through this lens. I'm not terribly comfortable, but I want to hear your perspective on adding points or subtracting points if a project doesn't come up with something very specific that points to this. Just because of kind of the newness of what we're trying to accomplish, I'm not sure we can hit this. And on the back end, how do we actually provide some quality control or some follow-up with any one of these points? And so I just want to get your take. maybe this could be filled out a little bit further as the program grows. But right now, I'm a little afraid of actually putting this into a point system. That's pretty subjective.
Yeah, so Jeff, is there a place in the application, or would you add one that kind of gets at this, like give people an opportunity to say, hey, we are seeking an innovative approach to address X historically marginalized community, and kind of lay it out, and then, or is it just, we would leave it to happenstance if someone decides to include it or not? And I see what you're saying about assigning points. I think if it goes in the application, do we have to assign, a point system to it, or, have it be part of our criteria, or, yeah. I don't know.
So I might suggest on this, Jeff, that we do kind of similar to maybe grant proposals, to be like, does your project prioritize traditionally underserved, socially vulnerable, or historically marginalized communities? If so, how? And please articulate your strategy. And then maybe we can use that as a differentiator as we're looking through the applications, right? Like that might be a way to be like, these are really close, but we like what this project is doing here. That might be one way to get at it.
Great point. I think that's kind of where we probably need to be, is that we can take that all in as just a component of the project. But we don't, and just back, I'd hesitate to say, hey, if it's a yes, you get 10 points. If it's a no, you get 0. I mean, I don't think we want to go there. Are we feeling good with that? Oh, I see some hands. Andrew, I saw yours first, and then Pete.
I just had a comment on that. One of the ways that we work through the DEI is in historically underserved communities. We offer, for example, in our EQIP program, it's 75% cost share and 90% cost share, versus non-historically underserved, it would be a 50-75. So yeah, we could rank their points, but we could also adjust the potential funding or the match requirement. So the projects are still created equal, but what they would get in terms of a cost share or a matching requirement could be tweaked a little bit as well.
Pete.
Thanks. I was just in my mind, I think of potentially 2 categories here too. There's sort of a more passive approach to centering or prioritizing traditionally underserved communities, and sort of the strategy or the project could address how it's intended to mitigate some of those impacts on those communities from, say, severe wildfire or severe wildfire smoke. But secondly, there's a more sort of proactive approach that would be actually including or, bringing that voice into the project itself and helping shape the project. So I wonder, to me, does that need to get reflected in the proposal? Or do we just sort of acknowledge that, a group may articulate a pretty compelling strategy about how they think the work they're doing is going to mitigate sort of impacts, doesn't necessarily mean that they've involved that underserved group in project development or in proposal development. But, so to me, 2 categories, passive versus more proactive.
Yeah, great point. Al, I see you, and then Chris. Al, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think it's something that definitely, it doesn't have to be scored at this point, but it's definitely something that they can report on, and something that we could track, and it can be used in our final reports. And that'll give us some good information just to build on where we're going with this, and some new avenues.
Thanks, Al. Chris?
Can you articulate to me a little more why we can't include this in the scoring? At some point, we got to enter into that business in earnest rather than just giving it rhetoric. And this is a chance to do that if we're willing to make that step.
Well, in my thoughts, and I'm just another person, so, I don't have to own this for sure. But as far as I'm thinking downstream. And so if I'm thinking of that large project on that landscape, and there was a component of DEI in some way, shape, or form that was in the application, I'm a little concerned about the reality of the day that one of our foresters goes out to meet with 2 or 3 or 5 of those entities on the ground and says, where is your DEI component? And folks are, you can see a stump, but I'm not sure that the quality control on the back end of closing out a project, I don't know if we're at a point where we have those folks in the field going out and saying yes or no, this has provided something for an underserved community or something like that. I hope I'm wrong, but what do you think?
And I think it's subjective, but we have to start somewhere too.
Jeff, I'd jump in and say that, maybe it's not something that's visible on the ground and, in the way of stumps or something like that, but it's in the project design, it's in the project location. It's in some of those larger, components of where that fits in on the landscape. And I think that's where there could be some criteria and some consideration in the ranking and scoring.
Okay, and how would that be reported out on the back end of a project?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know that there are necessarily quantitative measures there per se. Maybe there are, and maybe we need to get some help with that. But certainly there are some qualitative components, and that's really, I think, what I'm referring to. And Eric's got his hand up too. He might be able to share a little something experience from OWEB, but that's just where my mind, where my mind is at in trying to tackle this.
Okay, thanks. Eric, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of good feedback on this one from OWEB's perspective at this point. I mean, I think the OWEB board is starting to go down the path of how to try to incorporate DEI into our grant making, but it's not something that is going to be a quick turnaround, I imagine. So yeah, it's going to take a lot of thought on, at least from OWEB's perspective, to truly really incorporate it into the grant making. At the same time, and I appreciate how it's brought up here, Jeff, it does seem like maybe it can be brought into some of the criteria as currently written around sort of community engagement or communities in proximity to project sites. But I understand sort of the hesitancy around adding additional criteria at this point without it being sort of fully vetted. So it's a tricky one. I don't have an easy answer.
We have a box that I can pull this application up to, of course, but there's a box, an opportunity in there for collaborative, collaboration across the board, and how are you working with others? And it very well may fit in that box to describe your collaboration, how this is a cross-boundary project with lots of participants, and then also describe in some detail how you may be meeting this criteria right here. And so maybe that's in there, and we can assign, that could be rolled up as a point, as points in that box. Just a thought. One thing that we found in our grant experience for years, and this is not pejorative to anybody out there, but we find that there are some very good grant writers that are not good grant managers. And we found that there are some grant managers out there that don't write very well. And we've missed some projects that way. And so I'm just thinking out loud, does this become something that is easy for a very good grant writer to write in there without any kind of follow-up at the end that says, yeah, this worked or this didn't work? So that's where I'm kind of losing it a little bit.
I mean, off the top of my head, I think it's pretty easy to quantify. A lot of Oregon's contractors are underserved communities in many respects, Hispanic, Latino in particular, and you can easily account for that as serving these historically underserved communities. As just one example of a quantitative piece of information is the number of employed individuals. But then there's also, maps of social vulnerability on that, which can be brought in, and, collaborations with tribal organizations that can be easily accounted for. I don't think it's very hard to find this information, particularly if we're requiring monitoring. We just have to make the leap forward and expect that there is going to be some learning. It's not going to be perfect.
Would it be possible, recognizing that the timeline and stuff, would it be possible to, include this language, include an opportunity in the application for people to spell out, their plan for this? And I do think it's a different box than the collaboration box. Very much think they're different things. And then perhaps before award, we have a little bit of time to do some more research into what those metrics might be that others might be using, just to give us a better idea, and then think about how we might include them. And we could decide later on to leave it a little bit more subjective as opposed to like a ranking criteria. But I feel like we probably need to gather a little bit more information and wrap our heads around it better. But we could probably get the RFP out, close to as is, and think about that at a future meeting.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, Chandra. I would only, and just to play devil's advocate, so we go in eyes wide open on it. Would we not, is there a potential that we would not fund a project that is otherwise a very good project, but didn't highlight a DEI component? Because they just didn't know, or because they weren't capable maybe of pulling that information together. I'm just thinking the landscape scale of these projects, I would think would be probably pretty easy to include this in any of these landscape scale projects. But again, just thinking out loud, I like your idea though. A separate box is right. We can highlight it, we can put the language in here, and we can, begin the conversation. And if it turns out kind of clunky, then hey, lessons learned, and the next go around, we're going to improve on it. So I think I'm hearing, let's leave the language. I may add a couple of sentences in here on prioritizing and how we're going to be looking at this. And then in the scoring, or excuse me, the application material, there is an actual box where people can put some information in here about, these communities and this perspective and how they're going to proceed with the project. Does that sound okay?
There's a good suggestion in the chat, Jeff, that I think could be helpful. Fits right in with what you were saying, and asks the applicants to make some, offer some things to us, which could also be a good learning experience for us.
That is a great point. Yeah, thanks, James. Okay, I'll work that up. Okay, about 10 minutes. Let's see. Oh, you know what? Now we can also talk a little bit about Ed Keith's point about using the QWRA and the map that is surfaced. And I like the map. I think it makes some sense. We can certainly talk about that, but before we leave as well, I want to just reiterate a little bit of what the next step may look like and how we can all get back together and, allow us to do some work, get some things prepped, And then we can all get back together and have another conversation in a couple, 3 weeks, or even a little bit longer than that. So do we want to go into maybe a quick understanding of how the map and the QWRA is fitting into this process? Let's get to that.
Hey, Jeff, are we going to talk about the RFP at all in terms of some of the language, how you handle the revisions and amendments?
Well, what's on your mind, Rex? Because short answer, no.
Well, it's on the agenda.
Go ahead,
At
please.
the end, and I've
Please,
been
go
waiting
ahead.
for an hour and 50 minutes.
Hit us, Rex. Go.
On page 2 of the RFP is written down in the last section on that page 2, examples of implementation treatments that reduce fire behavior, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
There are 5 bullets.
Okay.
And I'm also pairing that with on the second page the page 3, the first half of page 3. What I'm doing is comparing and contrasting. You say what treatments are examples that would qualify or would be eligible, contrasted with examples of projects that would not qualify.
Okay. Following you there.
So on the not qualify on page 3, it says road construction, in particular construction. And then on page 2, under what are examples that would, there is no mention of access to these projects. And so my question to the group is, who's going to be doing this work? How are they going to be doing it? What are they going to be using in terms of tools and equipment? And how do they plan to access these treatment projects? And what I would propose is everybody presumes that there will be forest roads out there. Is that correct? Or is it going to be everything's a walk-in?
I don't know. Is there?
I'm hearing silence. And the reason I bring this up is because there's a presumption that all this is going to happen without any access. And what I will remind everybody is in Oregon, we have the Forest Practices Act and rules, which requires a very rigorous road access management and maintenance standard, such that if an operation is going to use a road or access a project, that there are very robust and stringent requirements for maintenance and management of that road, which includes some construction activities done by qualified, skilled professionals that are doing that maintenance and construction activity for, and what part of that's for water quality protection, part of it's for safety and habitat and the sustainability and all those good things that the Forest Practices Act provides. Well, anyway, it's pretty troubling that there is no mention of road maintenance or access, and there is a tacit prohibition against construction.
Well, I think Rex, that there's maybe an apple and an orange there, and that there's probably room for maintenance. And we tried to highlight that here in fuel breaks that may or may not include roadside treatments. And so there's an opportunity to treat along roads to manage fuel breaks. Maybe the word maintenance needs to be in here, but I think that road
that's what we're saying is when you say no construction, you realize that just about all maintenance is construction.
Okay, then we can
So
we can talk
yeah,
about
don't roll your eyes.
Rex, please.
I'm talking about the operational people that are implementing this, and you're writing a set of rules that is going to create a de facto prohibition from you having success, because you're creating a situation where when you go to implement, somebody will say, well, you can't do that. And so I'm trying to avoid the future pitfalls that one could predict in this sort of atmosphere that we work in nowadays.
Okay, that's a great point. I think we can certainly look at that. I think,
And I'm not bringing up a new issue. Amanda had, her comments had recommended that maintenance be clearly stated as a maintenance and associated construction activities be included in the revisions.
good point. We're running out of time, so I'm gonna put some notes down, duly noted, and we can add some of that language and facilitate some conversation over the next couple, 3 days on that. I would only say, though, from a perspective that road construction specifically sucks up big time money real fast, and that this money is not appropriate for road construction. And so
Well, you
it is
need to
about
define
treating
that in
fuel.
this then.
So we
because-
might have an opportunity, Rex, we might have an opportunity to limit what we call maintenance in a percentage. And so we've already gone up top here and talked about implementation being 70%. We've talked about monitoring and evaluation being 10%, and then 20% of planning. So we've already successfully worked through some of that percentage. And we may have an opportunity here to say, including in that 70% might be 5, 10, 12, 15% in road maintenance to provide access for a project. But I'd be very hesitant to just throw road construction out there as being a project.
I'm not asking for what you're defining and picturing in your mind as construction, but what I'm saying is not everybody has the same definition that you do, Jeff. And that
I'm sure they don't.
we're talking to a greater audience, and we need to have clear communication about what the expectations are for eligible and not eligible. And it's very troubling that this is silent on the most important part of this project is getting people and tools and equipment out to do this work. And it appears to me there's a complete absence of recognition of the Oregon Forest Practices Act and rules and what it requires of a commercial activity or an activity, a notified activity, commercial or not.
Okay, thank you, Rex. I appreciate you bringing that up. We've got 4 minutes left. If I could, I'll describe what the next steps may be. We'll have an opportunity to add some perspective, especially one that Rex has brought up over the next couple of days. But I would like to see that this proposal gets out perhaps, well, I hope for tomorrow, but maybe Monday or Tuesday, in that those planners out there and those applicants can put together a proposal quicker than later, because frankly, we're going to be bumping spring by the time we get agreements in place. And we are working on a tight time frame. I think that we've had a great opportunity to add, subtract language and get something that is not perfect, but it's pretty good. And then we'll have an opportunity to go through a workshop or webinar with those applicants and tease out some of these items and help them build a better mousetrap with our influence and input in what those projects look like. It's been done successfully, like I mentioned, with the NRCS. We can use that process as a model with their RCPP, and that provides a really nice one-on-one with applicants that have some questions. The application instructions, I'll crosswalk. Eric brought that up a couple of months ago or a couple of meetings ago. Thank you, Eric. And make sure that the language is right in how we roll out the scoring material as well. And then allow for that time frame to be open and circle back with a scoring matrix and instructions for our work group to review these and rank them, and then get into the actual agreements, hopefully in early January. Pete, please go ahead.
Well, I don't want to derail, but Jeff, I do think the other conversation you flagged about sort of thinking about Ed Keith's comments on the use of the wildfire risk Explorer or and the PNW QWRA data would be a valuable one to have. And I guess the reason I just want to put a pin in it, I'm thinking about the projects that might fall on the lower end of the grant size spectrum, you know, the $300,000 or $500,000 grant size. And, you know, let's just pick a random treatment cost out of the air of, you know, $1,000 an acre. Maybe it's not that much, maybe it's only 500, but still the overall footprint of that treatment ends up being relatively small. And I wonder, in that case, if using data at a smaller scale, like as Ed suggests, that 30-meter pixel data that could highlight that a project of a smaller size might actually be a fairly strategic and targeted investment of dollars to reduce wildfire risk at a point or at a series of points that doesn't necessarily show in the summarized watershed data, whether that's HUC 10 or HUC 12 or whatever. So anyway, it's just a conversation for a future date, because I think we might find that there are smaller projects that still could be significant or important at reducing wildfire risk, even if they're at a smaller scale that doesn't necessarily pop in that summarized QRA data. And I'd love to have Chris really get into the weeds of that for us and help us understand if that's a valid concern or not.
Thanks, Pete. Chris, you got some thoughts?
I do, but I don't have enough time right now. I need to facilitate another meeting, so.
Okay. Well, to that end, boy, dare I say it, do we put another one of these together for maybe, you know, next week, Wednesday, Thursday, something like that? I have a hard time because frankly, I know there's a lot of people out there that are ready to put plans in place. And each delay puts us further into fire season next year with no acres treated. It's a tough spot to be in. Please, Chandra, go ahead.
Is the mapping discussion that we want to have going to actually influence the maps that's developed, you know, that goes out with RFP, or is it more something that we can look at, refine the refinements that we're talking about as we develop criteria for projects after?
Yeah, good point. I would only think that, you know, if I was just a person sitting at a desk out there thinking of a potential project, I would want to maybe weigh that out and say, look, I could include, this particular landscape when I build this proposal with this kind of map, or I would involve not, and I would involve some other landscape. And so I think that the decision point out there does hinge to some degree on where we're looking at focused investments.
Yeah, so when we put together an applicant workshop, as you were talking about, it would be good to have that information to share and go through with applicants, is what I'm hearing you say. So yeah, maybe meeting sooner rather than later is important if we're going to plan that sort of workshop.
Okay, maybe what I think I'm hearing is we can get the RFP out, get the creative juices flowing, get people engaged and starting to work, and then we can circle back to 2 or 3 other items that we'd like to really discuss with an applicant pool in 10 days or 2 weeks time when they've had some time to think. Pete, please.
I think that sounds good. And I guess my question is, I think the language as stated makes it, I think people are making some assumptions about what our intent is if we're strictly talking about the averaged data at a HUC 10 level for the QRA. And maybe we can make that clear in that applicant Q&A that, you know, they could suggest projects that are finer scale. And if those indeed fall into places with higher risk and it's not necessarily captured at the watershed scale, then, maybe Chris, you had mentioned that maybe it's a sub-watershed scale that's more appropriate. So I don't know. I think we can get the RFP out there. I feel like Ed was making a bit of an assumption, and I don't know if that's baked in already to the way that the map presents the QRA data, that it has to be averaged versus summed, and at what scale, HUC 10, HUC 12, or can we use rasterized data to describe priority lands? But that would just be a question I think we could get to in as applications roll in. I just wouldn't want people not to put in an application because they look at a particular map and go, oh, I'm not in one of those 4 lands.
Right. Yeah, that has been a concern of mine too, is that when you look at that, people out in the other areas just say, forget it, I'm not even participating in this. That's troublesome for sure. So maybe there's even a little language in there that this is a priority of strategic lands where we can focus, but not end all be all. There's other opportunities to provide information that, I don't want to use the word proves, but does to some degree prove the importance or strategic location that might be in, someone's application. Prove out what that looks like. Yeah. Okay, I think that I and some of our staff here at ODF have some work to do. I want to tinker with this a little bit more and really kind of firm up the scoring matrix and the application, adding your great input today. I'd love to get that out for folks again, not necessarily for a full round of edits and comments that might delay, but an understanding of maybe where we are, knowing that perfect is not in the way of really good. And then we can catch up with another meeting in a couple of weeks that we can start looking at that real active engagement with applicants at that point. And then I need to work a little bit on the back end of this too, a scoring matrix and exactly what that looks like. So are we comfortable for today with any closing thoughts? Everybody feeling pretty good on where we are? Megan and I will send out a summary with some other items, making sure everybody's in the loop. And please, if you have any thoughts or concerns, I have just enjoyed the heck out of working with you folks and always available to chat. If you want to call or send an email, I wouldn't have it any other way. Please reach out to us. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Bye, everyone.